Hi, thank you all for being here. Here for this talk. So I'll be talking about coping and health-related cannabis motives and the mediating relationship between childhood trauma and problematic cannabis use that we've observed over time among emerging adult cannabis users. I have no disclosures to make, although the study is funded by NIDA. I'll talk a little bit more about the amazing study team that I'm working with later. Here's my agenda, just really quick, that I'll be going through some background, going through our methods. I want to spend the majority of the time talking about these results and some of the implications and how we might be interpreting these, because they're very interesting, very meaty. So I look forward to hearing any questions or ideas that folks have that might help us to understand or think about our next steps. So childhood traumatic experiences, which include experiences of sexual abuse, neglect, and physical abuse, have been associated with greater problematic cannabis use, which can include issues with psychosocial functioning and concerns about one's own cannabis dependence or negative cannabis-related consequences across the lifespan. So this research has been observed, or these pathways have been observed from adolescence the way through later adulthood. Prior research has shown that in particular, emerging adults or those that we're referencing between the ages of 18 and 29 may be more vulnerable to the impact of problematic cannabis use given the many changes in roles and developmental transitions that occur during this really formative period for them. One mechanism that has been highlighted in the literature is the pathway between child abuse and problematic cannabis use is motives for such use. This area of research has identified a range of motives that are related, including using to cope with emotional distress or negative affect, or managing health-related symptoms such as issues with insomnia or sleep. Despite strong evidence of these pathways, there have been limited examinations of such relationships over time to explore the stability of these associations. Further, while these findings have been mixed, there is growing literature that suggests that these pathways may actually be more present among those who have history of childhood sexual and emotional abuse compared to physical abuse. In a prior analysis conducted by our research group, we found that using cannabis to cope with emotional distress mediated the relationship between childhood emotional abuse and neglect and later problematic cannabis use, which also in the notes is related to or referred to as PCU, among young adults. We also found that using cannabis to manage inattention was also identified as a mediator in the pathway between physical neglect and problematic cannabis use. The current study is an extension of this initial analysis. It aims to address these two research questions. To what extent do cannabis motives for coping and health-related reasons continue to mediate these pathways that we observe between childhood trauma subtypes, so specifically childhood emotional abuse and neglect and sexual abuse, and problematic cannabis use at different time points later on in emerging adulthood among these cannabis users. We also wanted to know, what do we observe in terms of similarities and differences in these mediational relationships over time? And this is relative to what we found 2 years prior in our study. For these analyses, we hypothesized that coping motives and health-related motives, which I'll explain a little bit more, such as using for cannabis or cannabis for pain or sleep, would continue to significantly mediate these associations over time. This is a little bit of information about the study from which these data are derived. If folks are interested, I have our Instagram and our webpage at the end, and we definitely encourage folks to learn more about our study. And if there are folks who are interested in the data, learning more about some of the research that we do, or collaborating, we definitely welcome folks to reach out and learn more about what we do. But this is just some general information about the Kaya study, including who we collected the data on, and the current analyses that I'll be talking about today focus on waves 3 through 6. So we're currently in wave 8, and as I was sharing earlier, we still have 200 participants in our sample, so we have quite a great retention rate and great engagement from our participants. In the current analysis, these are just some descriptions of the measures that I'm going to be talking about. So we assessed for childhood trauma using the childhood trauma questionnaire that was administered at wave 2. We also utilized the modified comprehensive marijuana motives questionnaire. This is assessed at each wave and includes some original subscales of this related to cannabis motives, but we also added a few additional motives related to health associated reasons for cannabis use. And then in this study, we used 2 outcome measures of problematic cannabis use, the first being the DSM-5 cannabis use disorder measure, and the second being our severity of dependence scale, which assesses for your concerns or worries about the consequences of your own cannabis use. Our analytic approach used multiple mediation with 2 waves of data using the Hayes process macro and SPSS version 28. For the sake of time today, I'm going to be highlighting our significant mediation models and our interpretation. I would be happy to share further during the Q&A if folks have particular questions or following the presentation. You'll see in the figures that I'm going to show you that significant pathways are bolded and that significant mediators are highlighted with bolded boxes. The results are organized by trauma type and outcomes starting with our SDS or severity dependent scale outcomes. So in our first mediation model that we ran, we found that coping motives at wave 3 significantly mediated the relationship between emotional abuse and wave 4 SDS, and this effect was driven by those who experienced emotional abuse reporting using greater motives of using cannabis to cope with emotional distress. In the model for looking at emotional neglect, we found that the pain motive actually emerged as a mediator of the effect of emotional neglect on SDS. However, in this model, we found that the effect was driven by those that use cannabis for pain actually reporting less problematic cannabis use at wave 4, so that's 1 year later. Both coping and nausea motives significantly mediated the effect of sexual abuse on our wave 4 SDS. In the pathway for using cannabis for coping, the effect was driven by those who experienced emotional abuse, reporting significantly more use of cannabis for coping. And then in the wave 4 DSM-5 outcome, both sleep and pain motive emerged as significant mediators of the effect of emotional neglect on wave 4 DSM-5, and this effect was driven by those who've experienced emotional neglect being marginally less likely to use cannabis for pain management. And for the sake of time, I'm going to fly through these. I'm happy to share these later if folks want to see them more. This is an outline of where our studies results align between our initial study and the current study. As you can see, we found a greater amount of pathways actually later on when we were looking at later waves and back to limitations. But what I really wanted to spend the remainder of our time on is really highlighting the outcomes and what we found is of value in this study. So this study found that it was important to address or assess for a wide variety of motives, including health-related and coping motives. And this particularly became salient when we started to look at actually using for pain and sleep as potential buffering effects for those who might later have developed problematic cannabis use. So those who were using for those motives actually reported lower problematic cannabis use at later time points. Our findings also suggest the importance of employing different measures of PCU that might capture the range of outcomes. A lot of times we use DSM-5 or sort of more traditional clinical indicators, but we found that in our sample, and we found in a lot of our other research, that the SDS and looking at people's sort of self-perceived concerns or worries about their use is also a very valid and important indicator of problematic use. Just in closing, I'd like to highlight the amazing participants who've been a part of our study over the past 8 years and my co-authors and collaborators on this research, as well as the rest of our Kaya team.
Any questions?
Yeah, happy to go back to those models if folks want to look at them. It was a lot. We ran a lot of research, so folks want to take a moment to look through some of them. Yeah. folks have questions.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. So it looks like you looked at ACEs individually. Did you look at like cumulative ACE exposure? So those who experienced like 4 or more.
So we have so in the CTQ, we have like a total effect model, and we have run that. We found that it was more important for us to kind of look at the nuances in terms of the impact of the different types of trauma, because then you can see sort of like which pathways might be more driven by like folks who've experienced or have histories of sexual abuse versus emotional abuse and emotional neglect. And you might notice like we didn't actually find anything related to physical abuse and physical neglect. And some of those effects we found when we were looking at our total model were actually sort of pulled down when we looked at everything together. And that might have been, again, in part due to the fact that there were particular types of childhood abuse that were driving these relationships. But one thing that that we're thinking about actually as we're working on the revise and resubmit of this manuscript is whether if we looked at sort of cumulative effect, or with the CTQ, you can look at level of severity of the impact of trauma, whether that would be not just sort of like experiencing the trauma in and of itself, but like a cumulative effect, or the intensity or severity of how you feel like that's impacted you, whether that's would be more of like an accurate predictor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brigid.
We have one more question.
We have one more, sorry.
So I'm going to describe the problem I think you have, which I share with you in my studies. And so I just wonder if you have an answer to my problem. So, you're looking at something that happened a long time ago, and you're looking at 2 points in time. I don't know why, if you asked me what the hypothesis would be, I would say there'd be no change. So, unless you have some justification for why at these moments in time between the 4th and 5th observation, for some reason, you would see some radical change in behavior. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like it's a difficult task to try and identify pathways of a distal, although profound, experience in a moment of time. So, like, do you have any rationale for why you would think there would be a change?
Like a change in terms of like change in motive, like that they're changing their motives or changing their behavior over time. I mean, that's one of the things that we kind of wrestle with in terms of just developmental changes over time. We have collaborators in our group that are looking at developmental trajectories, and we do see that things like cannabis dependence and practices decrease over time, just in terms of like overall developmental trajectory, even among folks who self-identify as sort of chronic cannabis users. And so for us, we were curious as to whether, for participants who are reporting that they're more impacted by trauma, that their motives for use related specifically to sort of more emotional, psychological distress, or potentially like what we hypothesize are related to issues around insomnia and pain among folks who have complex trauma or childhood trauma, would be associated, with their changes in motives, and therefore associated with changes in whether they have problematic use over time. But that's separate from like their actual practices, right? Which I think we actually didn't remember correctly. We see changes in practices, but that's not an outcome that we're including in this analysis. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but like why we think particularly related to like those who've experienced trauma, that we would imagine that over time, if they're folks who are continuing to use to sort of for these specific reasons, that might be associated with later on having more or less, and what we found was less, issues with their cannabis over time. But you're right, that we wrestled with a couple of different analytic approaches to this, or, how to kind of, I think, contextualize these findings in light of the fact that this is all occurring, within sort of normative young adult developmental trajectories, and that's really hard for us to sort of, I think, control for, But really would welcome, like, if you have any thoughts or things that you all are thinking through about, like, what might be helpful kind of considerations for how to address that.
I'll let you know if I come up with
Thank you. Any other questions? Or?